Hi friends, it's Grace and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing a batch review of 3 more SPFBO 9 finalists that I read in approximately the last month. So with these 3 complete, that marks 6 books that I have finished and 4 more to go. And I was organizing my reading based on longest to shortest books. So seeing as the final 4 that I have to read are supposedly the shortest of the 10. I'm probably going to do all of those 4 in one review video later, but we'll see. Possibly I will do 2 and 2, but regardless, the next 3 books that I read are featured in this one that you are presently watching. So before I get into what the books actually are and do a little breakdown of how I rated them based on the SPFBO system, I'm just going to quickly go through the outline of what each rating means, and then as we go through the books, I'll explain like my feelings and reasonings for each actual score that I assigned. So the rating system, a 10 or 5 stars is perfect. Basically that means that you had no issues or like extremely minimal issues. A 9 is excellent, very good. Basically also no issues, but like small ones maybe. 8 is great, which means there are a lot of great things, still an overwhelmingly positive rating in my opinion. A 7 is good, which means like 75% good, 25% bad. Still, once again, not as strong, but an overwhelmingly positive rating right there. Then a 6 would be it's okay. There's still more good than bad, but it's dropping a little bit there. A 5 would be meh, which is like 50% good, 50% bad. Still good things to say, but clearly there are issues there. A 4 would be below par, which has a lot of issues, but still some good. And then a 3 would be needs more work, like 75% bad, 25% good. Honestly, those low ratings, like the really low ones, I don't really see any of the finalists doing that for me, because that's one kind of benefit about coming in and reading the finalists, is that basically a lot of other people have already vetted them for me and have said they're good, and I tend to generally agree with those people because there's quality in all of the things that I've read so far. But with that said, the 3 books that I'm talking about in this review are The Last Ranger by J.D.L. Roselle, The Fall Is All There Is by C.M. Kaplan, and Hills of Heather and Bone by K.E. Andrews. So we are going to go in the order in which I read these, and the first one of these that I read, I finished right at the beginning of February, is The Last Ranger by J.D.L. Roselle. So in this scoring system, out of 10, for me, The Last Ranger got a 6.9, which is basically a 3.5 star rating. Now, before I get into my specific ratings for each category, I'm just going to give a very brief synopsis. So in The Last Ranger, we follow our main character, Layan, or possibly Lane, but my brain says Layan, so that's kind of just what we're going with. So Layan is a ranger, and the rangers as an institution protect the Titan wilds, and they will try, and if there are any like monsters that have wandered into the area, they will try and like protect the area, shoo them back to where they're going. Like, they have the kind of essential function of rangers generally, but we don't explore that too much because the main idea of this book is that very early on, while Layan is out on an expedition, the lodge where the rangers live is attacked, and the rangers themselves are devastated, pretty much wiped out, and this main storyline is essentially a quest for revenge and also a mystery of trying to unravel the politics and the motivations and figuring out who actually did this, like who has the motivation to wipe out the rangers and why do they want to do this. So we follow our main character, we follow some unlikely companions that she meets and kind of like works with, maybe against her will, but we follow this quest, and that is our major goal of the book. So First of all, we have our category for characters, and I gave the book a 7 for characters. So still more good than bad when you're talking about that rating. I thought that some of the supporting characters were really strong and really interesting, compassionate. I would have liked to learn more about them. Honestly, the cast as a whole was fairly good. The biggest complaint for me, honestly, comes from the main character, because there were times when I didn't have an issue with her, and like in general, if we're talking about her motivations, like her motivation to avenge her fellow rangers, like I didn't have a problem with it. I thought that the characters had pretty well laid out motivations overall and emotions. To be honest with you, the trouble that I had was that we're in our main character's head, and she has very, very strong prejudices, and it was tough for me to read. Like, I don't know, like, characters don't have to be likable. I'm a huge proponent that characters don't have to be likable, but they have to at least be compelling, and you have to have, you have to feel engaged while you're in their perspective. And I just had a lot of trouble sometimes with the way that Layan thought and the things that she thought, and the refusal to grow or learn or change for a while there. And I wasn't enjoying that. So that's kind of where the 7 comes from. I still, like I said, think a lot of the side characters were strong, and I enjoyed them. Next up, for the plot, I also gave this a 7. This rating kind of reflects the fact that, like I said, I understood the goals and the motivations, and I did find it something that I could root for, like the goal that they're pursuing. But I also kind of had times where I wasn't sure. I didn't feel like we were moving forward, and it could possibly be because, reflecting back on how I was having trouble in our main character's perspective, if we slowed down the pacing a little bit to have a more character-focused moment, and I wasn't enjoying what our character was, like how she was growing, then I think that possibly those slower moments didn't feel as effective to me or as cathartic. So overall, I thought that the plot moved well, and I enjoyed it, and I thought it was good, but I think that there were those moments when the pacing didn't work, and I think that that could possibly be why. But overall, like, it moved well. We had goals, we worked towards them, so I have no real complaints about that part of it. Then for world building, I also gave this a 7. I thought that a lot of what was done with the world building and like the politics and the magic and stuff was really quite interesting. The nature-based magic system and the like titans that are sort of like these spirits of the wild, all of that was really, really cool. And that's one thing in particular, the magic, that I would like to learn more about. And the world building was interesting. I didn't really feel necessarily like I got a handle on the politics in this world. It was one of those situations where when you're following a character who is quite isolated for portions of the book and doesn't really know who to trust, you only get their perspective and what they know. And our main character was also somebody who wasn't super interested in politics. So when regions or cities or even countries or names of people's positions were being mentioned, it wasn't clear to me how those fit into the structure of society and what the implications were necessarily. So I maybe would have liked to learn a little bit more about that, but what JDL Roselle was beginning to build there seemed interesting. I think that I would need more time with it to get a handle on it, but I can definitely appreciate that. And a lot of the setting was interesting and well done as well. Next up is the writing, which I also gave a 7. And the writing, I didn't really have any complaints about it, but I also didn't really feel strongly positively about it either. Like, because in my opinion, it didn't really have anything special about it that I can remember now a month after reading it. It didn't have a super strong personality or anything like that, but then it also wasn't weak, it wasn't bad. Like, the descriptions of the magic were really nice, I do remember that, but at the same time, it's just kind of like, it was good. And that's pretty much the extent of my feelings on it, because it didn't do anything that made me think that it was really individual. And then finally for enjoyment, I gave The Last Ranger a 6.5. So like I said, I did try not to knock the character category based on the main character because I thought that some of the side characters were strong, but despite thinking that there were other strengths and that a lot of the stuff was good, I did lower the enjoyment score slightly just because I did have a lot of trouble with reading from Lane's perspective. It was a short book overall, and I didn't have a bad time by any means, but there were times when I really just didn't want to be in her head because I didn't like what I was finding there. I found it really difficult sometimes to read like these strong negative prejudices towards entire groups and the unwillingness to change, and I think that that's just reflected in the 6.5, which is lower than the ratings of 7 that I gave it across the board otherwise. So that all averages out to a 6.9, which is about a 3.5 star. So this is a book that I don't really feel super strongly about, where I have positive things to say about it, but I didn't love it, and then I also have some complaints. So this is one that falls like quite squarely in the middle. Like, I know that 3.5 is technically an above average rating, and it still is because like I thought that the book was good and I don't want to punish it for the main character not being to my tastes, but I can't necessarily completely overcome that when it comes to like my enjoyment. So I know that a lot of people have loved The Last Ranger more than I have, and so I still think that this is one that people should really be giving a go, because I think that it has the classic kind of ranger type of character that people like and a quest type that people like, with the political intrigue and the mystery surrounding that, and just a lot of good things going on as well. So I would still recommend this one. Next up, we have The Fall Is All There Is by C.M. Kaplan, and this is a book that I would honestly describe as something that falls squarely outside of my comfort zone, and just has a lot to be said about it. Like, it is a memorable book, but it's not necessarily something that aligns with my personal preferences. So this is a book that follows our main character, Peter Mercy, and Peter is one of a set of quadruplets, and they are essentially the royal children. So the oldest of them has been groomed for the throne, but there is another one of them that also wants the throne. But Peter, right when he was coming into adulthood, when he was around 18, he left home. He didn't want anything to do with all of this mess with his family, and he found another place to live. He's been gone for about 5 years now, but when the book commences, Peter's father has died, and now it is time for the royal succession. It is time for all of this mess to take place, and his siblings want him to come back. And he doesn't want any part of this, but he also doesn't want to detach himself so much that his siblings think he's actually opposing them and trying for the throne. So he kind of has to go back to try and sort all of this out and to be involved, even though he doesn't really want to be involved. So this is a book that overall, this ended up for me with a 6.6, which is about a 3.25 stars. And this definitely falls in the sci fantasy genre, because while this is definitely fantasy, it also has some strong sci-fi elements and a really weird, interesting mix of all of these for a setting. So the first category, once again, is characters, and I gave the characters in this one a 7. So this kind of reflects the fact that I think that in general, the sibling dynamic was done well, in the sense of the fact that they have the general underlying support that family generally has for each other, like that unconditional association with one another, and they do have love for one another, but they fight like crazy. There were a few characters that I didn't really like, or whose motivations I simply didn't understand. And I don't know, our main character, Peter, he was interesting to read about, but I didn't necessarily always feel engaged with him. There were some parts of the book where I was like, I don't get it. So I don't know, the 7 is kind of, there were definitely some strengths. Like, there were some very memorable character interactions, and I felt like Peter, as our main character, as somebody who has autism and who also has some like mobility issues and physical issues was like a character that it was very well done. I thought the insight into what he's like and how his brain works, because he feels very different from his siblings, and I think that it was well done being in his head, like, but there were some times where I was like, Peter, what are you doing? I don't know. So I don't know, the characters are kind of an entirely mixed bag, where I still feel generally more positive because they were memorable. Next up, we have plot, and I gave the plot for The Fall Is All There Is 6 out of 10, just because I felt like we didn't really have a goal, or at least the goal that we thought we set out with ended up being a very meandering, unclear mess. So, not a mess, but like it felt messy. So we kind of have the first part where Peter needs to go back home, but then after that, everything just kind of gets like, you think you're working up to a certain thing and then you're just not, and the pacing kind of threw me off, and there was a lot of travel and a lot of kind of nothing happening, or where I didn't know what was happening or what we were working towards. So I still, for the most part, found it easy to read. So like, I don't think that I have like a negative feeling about it. Like, it still is more good, but I didn't feel like it was really, really good, if that makes sense. I'm trying to use the language from the rating scale just to know how I'm aligning myself there. Next up is world building, and I gave world building a 7 because I thought that it was pretty interesting how in this world, and the fact that we are definitely having some sci-fi elements, some futuristic elements, it has to do with the fact that in the past, human beings have clearly caused 2 catastrophic world-ending events. It's not spoken of a ton in the book, but clearly there was one catastrophe that kind of ended the world as we currently know it, and then after that, they sort of rebuilt to a certain extent, but then there was a second one, and now they're kind of living in this weird amalgamation of like cyborgs with like medical advancements, with something called like ghost breath, where if you go outside you have the risk of breathing in the souls of people who have died, so you need to protect yourself when you're out in the world. And I don't really know where that came from in terms of like real human history, whether that was part of one of these world-ending events, but it was a very interesting setting. Like, I will give it that. It was odd, and like, for example, a lot of larger houses and dwellings are built inside of the bones of massive animals that were left behind. We don't learn a ton about all of that. We kind of just get it like dripped in here and there, like slight details to keep you wondering. So I did think that it was very interesting, but I also think that there was a lot going on, and in a way it sort of detracted from some of the character stuff that I thought he was trying to do. So I don't know. Once again, some sort of mixed feelings on this one, because I do have positive things to say in terms of the fact that like, I think that the setting was really creative. So a 7 for world building. Then I also gave this a 7 for writing, because I do think that the writing was memorable and the writing had personality, and that is one of the most like positive things that I can say personally, because a lot of these, once I get farther away from reading them, I simply don't really remember what the prose was like if it didn't have some kind of thing setting it apart. And I will say that The Fall Is All There Is, it did have personality. He had a distinct style for the way that the character thinks and talks, and just embodies like his internal monologue embodies the character, and he speaks in a certain way, and his siblings all have that as well, and the way that they talk to one another and the way that they fight is very kind of like sarcastic and cynical, and it definitely had that quality to it. Now, I don't even necessarily know if this falls under the writing per se, but one thing that I do remember from the writing is that there was a lot of violence and a lot of fighting in close quarters, and when that happened, there was a lot of the time where I really just felt like the character should be destroyed, like absolutely obliterated. Like, you're not getting back up from this because you're just a human. Like, you've been punched like 20 times and all you felt was like you saw stars for a little bit, but now you're up again and fighting. So that was something that really took me out of the story a few times. To be honest with you, this probably falls more under enjoyment, which I gave a 6. And I think that with this being an overall 3.25 stars, this is honestly my biggest complaint, is that this thing kept happening where it took me out of the story, where I was looking at the violence that was happening and thinking, this is so unrealistic, because you have these futuristic like taser gun weapons and you have all of these interesting weapons that he came up with, but you also just have people literally fist fighting each other. And this has always been a pet peeve of mine, because like in real life, if you get punched and you fall and you hit your head, you could literally be in the hospital. You can't just casually take like 20 punches to the head and be fine. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm just imposing my real life perspective a little bit too much, but it kept taking me out of the story and I couldn't really avoid just feeling that disconnect, because every time it happened, I couldn't suspend my disbelief for it. So I genuinely think that with enjoyment, that was my biggest complaint. I did think also that the violence was a little bit gratuitous sometimes, but that also, it entwines into the same complaint. So in terms of enjoyment, the 6 reflects that like I have this one big complaint, but I still think that there were strengths to the book and that people could really enjoy it just because of this like plucky, cynical, sarcastic character and the like memorable nature of it, and the kind of like leaping off the page characters and stuff. So definitely still a good, like above average rating in my opinion. I guess technically average would be a 2.5, but I always forget that. For me, average is like a 3 probably, because if I rate something a 3, it probably means that I thought it was fine, but I didn't think it was anything special. So if we go a little bit above that, I'm like, yeah, I have more positive than not things to say, but I have my complaints as well. So that is The Fall Is All There Is by C.M. Kaplan. Then finally for this video, we have Hills of Heather and Bone by K.E. Andrews. And so this book is about our main characters, who are a married couple, and Morana is our main female protagonist, and she has the abilities of a bone weaver, which is essentially kind of like necromancy. There are multiple types of magic in this world, and bone weavers live in fear because their powers are feared and they can be prosecuted, or I guess I should say persecuted probably. They could be prosecuted or persecuted for their powers because people don't really understand them and people fear them. And Morana's husband, Percy, is a flesh mender and a root sower, which means that he has both the power of healing people and also the power of like growing plants and kind of like manipulating plants and plant life in that way. So her powers kind of have to do with death and his powers mostly have to do with life. It's a very interesting dichotomy there, but they are basically found out somehow. The people called the, oh my gosh, I can't remember how to pronounce it, finalists, maybe. They are kind of like the police, if you will, where they have found out that a bone weaver lives in town. They have circled in on Morana and Percy, and they have to flee their home. And so they are essentially forced out on the run, and they are trying to make it through together, but this is something that Morana has struggled with for most of her life, is trying to stay ahead of the people who could find her and hate her because she is a bone weaver, even though she doesn't, use her powers for anything nefarious. So first up for characters, in this one I gave this a 7 for characters. This is a book overall that I have some mixed feelings about just in general, so that's going to be reflected in, I think, all of my ratings. This actually came out at the same rating as The Fall Is All There Is, like a 6.6, which translates to a 3.25, but for the characters, I gave the characters a 7 because, I don't mind at all having a married couple with an established relationship, But, and I feel like this is going to sound super cynical of me, for the most part, with the characters, we didn't really have like an interesting dynamic between them, in my opinion, because I am all for a relationship being like sweet and supportive and positive, but for most of the start of this book, like there was little to no conflict, even in small ways, in my opinion, between these characters. And I was kind of like, okay, they're on the run, and I know that that is a major conflict in their lives, but we didn't get to know them beforehand when we started the book. So for the first maybe 20% or so, I was honestly kind of bored following these two characters. Some stronger character moments came in later when we met some other people along the way. I did think that the side characters were pretty strong, and then more towards the end of the book, I started to enjoy more about our characters' internal journey. But I will say that during the early going, I was not super engaged. Now, the same can kind of be said for the plot. So next up is plot, and I gave plot a 6.5. And so the reason for this is that I was so unsure about my feelings for the first maybe 30% of the book. I understood that these characters were on the run, but like I said, it happened very quickly. We didn't know them. We really weren't invested. Like for me, it's very tough to have an inciting event that happens immediately that you are supposed to care about what happens in that event, because I don't know the characters yet. I don't care about them yet. And that was kind of what the whole first part of this was for me. Now, there is a wrinkle that's introduced that did make it a little bit more interesting, but even then I didn't feel like that much was done with that wrinkle until later on. So the plot for the first 30 to 40% was plodding along for me, and like I said, towards the end of the book it got a bit stronger. There was a particular part that I liked, and then the ending I thought had a good climax as well. But then before that, I really wasn't so happy with how it was going. Next up is world building, which I also gave a 6.5. The one thing that I thought was well done in terms of the world building was the magic, because we really got to see some cool stuff. I did think that this whole kind of plant theme and bone theme for the book and for the magic system was well done, and I liked learning about that. But I didn't necessarily feel like we got to learn enough history. The history was referred to, but if this is taking from real folklore, and I don't know for sure that it is, but if it was, it's something that I don't know about. Now, the whole thing was very Irish, so it could be taking from real things in Irish folklore, which is totally fine, and I think that it's actually really interesting, but I just don't know what it is. So when it was teased and mentioned but not really explained, I wasn't really able to get a full grasp on it. So, and I also understand that that wasn't the focus. Like, the characters were very much the focus, but I do think that the world building taking a little bit of a back seat just made me feel generally like I have positive things to say about it, but it wasn't as strong as it could have been. I don't know, that's obviously just my opinion. The writing, I gave a 7. I did feel like the writing was good, and I did feel like K.E. Andrews took a lot of care to approach the more emotional things she was like putting in her book, because overall, this book is quite dark. It's I wouldn't call it depressing necessarily, but it's dark and it doesn't have a happy tone. It has a very somber tone throughout. And I do think that her writing served that purpose well. I thought that it was good. But then once again, like I said, early on, I was really not engaged. So the writing wasn't really doing enough for me to bring out those emotions. That kind of came later, which is why I can't call it really super high, because I did have just a large portion of the book where that happened. And then for enjoyment, I also unfortunately gave this a 6. Not that that's negative, like it's still more positive than negative, but I just can't avoid the fact that early on I was plodding my way through this. I was forcing my way through it, and I am happy that later on I started to enjoy it more, but it didn't have a consistency all the way through. The first half was really a struggle for me. So the ending was definitely stronger, and I am happy that I got to see those strengths, because it did allow me to see that, like, other people have quite positive things to say about this book and they love it. And I'm always happy to be able to say, yeah, maybe this didn't work as well for me, but I can see why other people really liked it. For the first little bit, I wasn't really feeling that, but at least now by the end, I can say, like, I definitely can see the appeal, and I feel like I can recommend it to others with still expressing some of my own caveats. But then again, like, some of those things aren't going to bother other people, and that's fine. The one thing that I would say with this book is that the author does include a fairly lengthy list of trigger warnings, and I would definitely recommend reading that before you go into this book, just because I do think that it was a really good decision to include those. They are definitely necessary, and I wouldn't want anyone to be unaware of the content in some of these, like, scenes and storylines, because I do know that they are ones that could really affect you if it is something that you are sensitive to. So with that said, once again, Hills of Heather and Bone got a 6.6 from me, a 3.25. So this, honestly, review is kind of full of books that I have positive things to say about them still, but they weren't the ones that just worked the best for me. And it is unfortunate that that happened, but I still want people to be able to see the strengths in these, or at least hear about them and decide for themselves whether they want to pick these up. And I'm confident that there are going to be people who really enjoy all three of these books. So that is it for the three books that I'm talking about in this review. Please let me know down in the comments what you think of this video and of any of these books. Please like this video if you like it, subscribe if you'd like to see more from me. As always, I will have my Discord with Ben and my socials linked in the description if you're interested in any of that stuff. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye!